Well, good afternoon and good morning to listeners in the Americas. Early or later good evening to listeners in Europe and Middle East and Africa. And hello in the middle of the night to people out in Asia, Australia, and so on. Welcome listeners from around the world to this edition of Fred Plotkin on Fridays. I'm not superstitious. It is Friday the 13th. It happens to be the year 2020, which is its own particular thing. But I decided today to invite an artist to join me who is, we don't pay attention to dates and things like that. We pay attention to art. And you've noticed already that I've twice used the word art and artist in less than a minute. Regular listeners know I don't use that word all that often, and I really reserve it for people to whom it applies. And it certainly does in every way to my guest today, Catherine Malfitano, joining me also in New York City, further north than where I am, in her home. And Catherine is known to many people as an outstanding soprano, actor, actress, I don't know which you prefer, stage director, master teacher, figure in cinema, all around New Yorker. And I think I want to focus a bit today on what it means to be a New Yorker in the arts. But I will start by welcoming Catherine Malfitano.
Hi, Fred. It's great to be here.
So I think I want to start with a question. It's something that you and I share. We grew up in New York City. We grew up in Manhattan. We didn't know each other as children. We didn't even know each other as young adults, but we knew each other as slightly less young adults, not older people, but less young adults, and discovered that we had a lot of commonality in our relationship to our city. I went to New York City public schools. I believe that you did as well. And we come from a time when it was possible for any young person, and not just someone with an interest in working in the arts, to get a fantastic cultural education in the city. What was yours like growing up in terms of what the city gave you, not just your parents?
I'm curious to know where you went to school, Fred, in New York, and but I was very fortunate, first of all, to be born in Manhattan. Uh, Everyone says, "Oh my God, that's rare, isn't it?" And I think, no, I don't think it's rare. It's just that there are not many people who are born in Manhattan and are pretty much for their whole lifetime based in Manhattan, which I am still. And growing up in New York City, in Manhattan, was extraordinary. And I must say that I had a combination of love and hate about growing up in New York City. And only, I'll just segue for a quick moment and we'll come back to this. Only once I started to travel internationally did I fully appreciate what New York was about. Because when you grow up in New York, you think the rest of the world is like New York. That's a typical New Yorker's point of view. Everywhere must be like New York, and of course it isn't. That's the truth of the matter. But I was extremely lucky because I was born into a family that is a theatrical family, with my father being a violinist and having done many solo recitals at Carnegie Hall, but also he played in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra from a very early point of my life. And my mother had been a dancer at American Ballet Theater, but also at the Met in the Corps de Ballet. So I basically grew up in the Met, as it were. I was a child of the Met, and my schooling included such things as the High School of Music and Art, which now is known as a part of the LaGuardia High School I guess, just the LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts, a
Mhm.
very long title now. But at that time, being in the High School of Music and Art, and then subsequently I was accepted to the Manhattan School of Music, it meant that most of my early training really was done here in New York City.
Um, just to answer your question, I too was born in Manhattan, And the room I'm in now is about a half mile from the hospital where I was born, so I haven't come very far. I was absconded to Brooklyn for 8 years, but that was a pleasant experience growing up in Brooklyn in a wonderful, we call it the People's Republic of Brooklyn, intensely cultural, uh, politically very progressive. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, I grew up in a completely integrated community of races, religions, cultures, and we were all just kids in New York. We were not Italian or Jewish or Irish or German or African American or Latino. You pick it. We were just kids, and we played together. And I look back on that now as sort of a remarkably blissful time, in that my earliest formation was that you had your bunch of friends, and there were not identifiers. You were friends, and that was really it. And our parents, in a very forward thinking way, embraced that as well. And I think that's a great thing that Brooklyn gave me that maybe Manhattan didn't quite have in the same way. I could be
Well,
mistaken.
I think, not mistaken, but actually Manhattan was a big, how do you say, melting pot, as it were, because schools like music and art or performing arts audition kids from all boroughs. So therefore, my atmosphere at the High School of Music and Art, and I would at Performing Arts, it would be the same, was very, very integrated. Certainly, my elementary school was, and my junior high school was, which was it was called Joan of Arc,
I
and
didn't know that. I went to Joan of Arc.
oh my God, you're kidding me.
No, I'm not. It's a block from where I'm sitting now.
Yes, yes, and
My mother went to Joan of Arc.
oh my God. Well, there we found another connection between us. And I was, yes, and it was, we lived on 92nd Street right on Broadway, off Broadway. And I used to just walk up the street to go to Joan of Arc and sometimes up to 93rd to go into the actual entrance, but often there was a way to come out on 92nd Street and go home for lunch and things like that. But it was uh, uh, somewhat, I would say, rather integrated school, very integrated.
It definitely was.
Yeah, though there were some features about it that were interesting. I don't know if we'll get around to talking about that, but they had certain kinds of classes that created, I think, some problems that were things like, I don't know if you remember, intellectually gifted classes
On
where
the eighth floor,
I don't even
there
remember
was a
what
separate
floor.
elevator that took the intellectually gifted kids up to the eighth floor. So we were separate. I
God,
was
that's
one of
even
them.
worse than I remember
We
then.
were separated from the other kids, actually. Yeah.
And it wasn't a really wonderful thing from a point of view of the school and the feeling of there were some of us being treated in a slightly different way. So it was a kind of a microcosm of issues that have come up a lot in recent times, but
Yeah.
also were very strong in that time too, in the 60s. So, but it was a very fine education that I got there in
Hmm.
those classes, and I had some extraordinary teachers there,
So did
uh,
I.
and I learned a great deal there. And the same for the High School of Music and Art, which was extraordinary. And I
Let me
had
go back, if I can, to Joan of Arc for a moment.
yes,
Um, well, first, I want to go back to Brooklyn for just another moment. Brooklyn had the Brooklyn Academy of Music, known as BAM.
hmm
And when I was a very small boy, they had arts programming every day for neighborhood kids. It was not a special thing to sign up. If you wanted to come, you did. And I always needed dental care, and my dentist was across the street, and a good bakery was across the street. So the whole day was arts, dentistry for the pain, and then a nice jelly donut. And Brooklyn gave that, and Manhattan to it, all the boroughs, and does still. But in our time, everything was much cheaper, so that it was really accessible to everyone. And then when we moved back to Manhattan, Uh, you said you were a child of the Met. I was a child of the New York Philharmonic and
Mm.
grew up at Lincoln Center, literally across the street from Lincoln Center. And my mother worked there. My stepfather was at Columbia Records. And I was part of Leonard Bernstein's nucleus group, his focus group for his young people's concerts. And our childcare was really the guards at Philharmonic Hall, as it was called. And Maestro Bernstein, Lenny, said, don't let these children sit out in the lobby, bring them into the concert hall. And that's how we began to get our education. I certainly went to opera as a small child, but I was taken, whereas the Philharmonic was really my home. But anyway, Joan of Arc, I went to vote there the other day. And Joan of
Oh,
Arc, if you, that's my voting place, if you remember, has a magnificently large auditorium.
yes,
And I
yes,
don't know about schools elsewhere, but this was a professional quality place for staging musical performances. And we had an orchestra, and I was in the chorus. And we had a wonderful music teacher, Mr. Weber. And we had a very solid musical education program. When I was in Brooklyn in nursery school and kindergarten, we had teachers who were required to play the piano. And I remember my teacher, Miss Nafee, I was about 5 years old. The very first two pieces she played, and Children Learn Everything, were by Poulenc and Brahms. And we learned to sing what she played. So already the foundations were there, not just for me, but for every child in that class to be exposed to music and that it not be alien, but to be completely integrated into the program. At Joan of Arc, we performed music all the time. I don't know about you. Did you have that in that auditorium?
yes, but I don't remember it so well. What I remember about my time in at Joan of Arc was it was the first occasion I had to perform with my dad,
Mm,
the first of many. But and we did Ave Maria together, and he played the violin and I sang. And I believe it was in that auditorium. So I do remember that. And as far as the chorus and such, I don't remember it so well because at that time I was deeply involved with the old borough-wide chorus that was led by John Motley.
I was in it too.
Oh my goodness, oh my goodness. But we were not probably at the same time.
No, a few years apart.
Yeah, I would think.
Yeah.
And so that's what I remember about my junior high school time that also moved into the high school time, not only at music and art, which became more solo voice for me, and then not choral so much. And there was a wonderful woman there that really got me going in terms of being a soloist. And I did something, you mentioned Poulenc, and I did the Poulenc Gloria as the
That's what
solo.
we had. Yeah. That was it. Yeah.
And I was 16 years old as a soloist for the Poulenc Gloria, which is, I think about that now and tremble thinking, how could I? I had a lot of courage and chutzpah, as one does. And, but for the borough-wide chorus with John Motley, again, the kids all came from all over to audition for to be in that chorus. And then, as I said, we moved on into high school. Peter J. Wilhowsky was the head of the chorus in high school, the all city-wide high school chorus. And this was a big deal in New York. I mean, it
Yeah.
was a time when
It still
culture.
is. I know a young man who got in the other day.
Oh, I'm glad to know it still exists.
Yep.
But in
They're
that
doing
time,
it virtually right now.
oh, wow, that's something. But
Yeah.
then when Peter J. Wilhowsky retired, which was after my first year in the high school course, John Motley took over for him. So, and John Motley was also one of my main mentors early on because he was the one who actually said, "Catherine, you have to audition for the High School of Music and Art, and have your dad teach you something." And he said, in fact, have him teach you "O mio babino caro,"
Hmm.
which is what I auditioned with for the High School of Music and Art. And so there's so many connections when you're brought up in New York City, the glorious thing is the opportunities to be exposed at every level in education or in the actual houses, whether for me it was at the Met from a very early age, but also Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall was one of my most prize learning areas of my life, where I heard the greatest artists
Yeah.
coming through at that time. The list is long of people like Victoria de Los Angeles and Disca.
Catherine, I'm going to stop you right there. That was the first solo recital I heard was Victoria de Los Angeles.
Well, she's a very
Yeah.
special person in
Huh.
my history. There are a few songs that I remember her singing. One was Le Violette, and it's one of those typical songs from the old Italian songbook that we all get to learn through high school years and sometimes sing it later on. And I can to this day remember that crystal clear and joyful sound that she could bring. Los Clavelitos was another one of her special songs that she sang. And then, of course, for us who saw her, the audience wouldn't leave until she brought her guitar out at the end
Yes. Yeah.
and sat there and played, I think it was De Falla, something like
Hmm.
that. And
And Monsalvace.
yes, Nina, Nina, yes, that's right. Oh, yeah, it was exciting. But
Yeah.
Discount with all of his Liederabend and all of them were extraordinary. He was a lesson just to be able to behold him. But I later became an usher there at Carnegie Hall.
Mhm.
And that was exciting too,
Can I
because
ask basically what year you might have been an usher there?
that's a good question. I would say around 71.
Okay. My mother worked there from 1969 to 1972. So in that period, I was less a Philharmonic child and more of a Carnegie Hall child. So I just feel that already we've discovered we went to the same junior high school. We lived 2 blocks away from one
And your
another, which
mother
I
was
didn't know.
there. Maybe we were ushering at the same time.
Well, I wasn't ushering, but I was basically resident in the
Yeah,
hall just because in my family we view offices as daycare. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and I
yeah.
was lucky that my mother's office was always an opera house or a concert hall.
Well, that is very lucky, and to be at Carnegie Hall during those years was extraordinary,
Yeah.
because the talent you could see between the classical and whether it was, I don't know, Janet Baker and these guys doing Das Knabenwunderhorn and huge, gorgeous works like that, as well as the intimate recitals of great artists. But there was also at that time, do you remember, um, artists like Sammy Davis Jr., who
Do.
performed on the Carnegie Hall stage, and there was Laura Nero, who was also there, and I heard Earth, Wind, and Fire, the group,
Mm-hmm.
on the Carnegie Hall stage.
Yeah.
So Tina Turner. It was exciting. It was an
Yeah.
exciting time to be in New York, but also to be an
Sure.
usher and see these things free every night.
I want to mention something for our listeners that you and I know, but a lot of people outside of New York don't. For one thing, I want to mention that if you go back to YouTube and look at Fred Plotkin on Fridays, Clive Gillinson. I had the executive director of Carnegie Hall on this program back in May, and he was fascinating, June, sorry. And he was fascinating about arts management, about the role of culture, especially about education and the education of young people in the arts. And he's a model for me, and I was very happy to have him. But the other thing is, we think of Carnegie Hall as this august, beautiful historic theater, which it is. But it also, uniquely among the great halls of the world that I know, has always been the people's place. And the doors are completely open. And if you are a New Yorker, you are made welcome there, and also from elsewhere. But I remember in the All City Chorus that we performed there every
That's
year.
right. We
And
did too.
so I stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall numerous times as a child. I got to sing a Grieg solo one year. And so that it be it's home. I adore the Metropolitan Opera. I work there. I adore Lincoln Center. I support them and so on. But Carnegie Hall, even though I worked at the Met and I never actually worked at Carnegie Hall feels Heimlich. It feels like home.
Well,
And
and it also has the most extraordinary acoustics. I mean, everybody in that hall sounds truly, truly amazing. It's got a warm acoustic and it's got a brilliant acoustic. It's a real chiaroscuro
yeah.
hall in terms of its acoustic. And I sang there too many times after that as well with my father. Also, we performed there for when we started doing our voice and violin compositions together. And then much later on, I mean, the last time I sang there was for Bill Bolcom's Medusa, which he wrote for
Hmm.
me, a 45-minute monodrama
Hmm.
with Russ, Dennis
Dennis
Russell
Russell
Davies
Davies. Yeah.
and the 19 players of the Stuttgart string orchestra. And I brought even one of my chairs, a high chair from my apartment, to use as my prop for the whole monodrama. And that was the last time I sang there. But from like you, I was also a part of John Motley and Will Houseke's concerts with the chorus and singing things like Hallelujah chorus
Hmm.
and some spirituals too, which
Yeah.
I actually wanted to put one of those spirituals on the list, but it was something that John Motley always had us sing. I've been buked and I've been scorned with the chorus. And then with Wilhowsky, we learned something, and I'm sure you remember. It was called Madame Jeanette,
Sure. Yeah.
and that was something that was arranged by him. Actually, when you find the music, you see arranged by Peter J. Wilhowsky, as he did with so many pieces. Um, I like to credit the choral training I had, and I was very lucky to have these two gentlemen in my life and that experience. But I love the choral training I got from them. I think that for young voices, it's a great bonus to be in a chorus. As I said, I went when I went to Manhattan School, not sorry, Music and Art. There was a woman there named Sybil Mandel. I don't know if you remember her name.
Well, I didn't go to music and art. The
Oh,
only the only mistake I made in my life, the consequential mistake I think was I auditioned. I got into music and art for singing. I was the only boy accepted that year, which would have meant I would have had all the leading
all the
roles.
attention and everything.
Um, through because Herman Pride, the baritone, was a friend of my family. He's the one who taught me Papageno's aria that I used to audition. And my professional musician father, who grew up in the Depression, was so panicked that I would enter the arts and have a life of always looking for work and the lack of safety and security and all of that that a quote regular job would provide. I got into a high school in New York called the Bronx High School of Science, which
Oh
is
yeah.
very prestigious and hard to get into. And yes, I was the star of all the shows at Bronx Science, but they didn't have that much cultural stuff going on there. And I got a good scientific education. I don't remember a thing from mathematics, an excellent history education. And that really was my underpinnings. I had a history teacher at Bronx Science who said to me, "You should have gone to music and art. I will take responsibility for your cultural training and point you down the history road. So when you go to work in opera, as I know you will have the historical and linguistic underpinnings." So one great teacher, Mrs. Sagos, there saved me and pointed me back into opera. But ultimately, I don't know if I would have become a singer, but ultimately that was just not part of the program because uh, both my parents actually were very fearful. My mother went to music and art for singing, and we're just different people. I would have pursued it, but then ultimately, I'm happy where I wound up. and I'm happy that I had the training I had. But I missed I missed not going to music and art. I will say that because it's a very
Special.
wonderful school. Yeah,
It was
I
very
know.
special, and I mean, our daughter Daphne also went to well, now it became LaGuardia when she went to school, so she was trained there, but in the drama department.
Yeah,
But I think Manhattan School of Music and Music and Art, the two schools really were the foundation of my becoming a performer, as well as my father teaching me and so forth. But I think I was extremely lucky to have been born in New York City and to have had the opportunity and training from this city. And it was, pretty much all free, even at Manhattan
yeah.
School of Music at that time. Tuitions weren't that high, and I got pretty close to full scholarship. So I was always given a great education. Plus, I was at the Metropolitan Opera all the time,
Where your
all the
dad worked.
time. Yeah, since I was a very young child,
Yeah,
and we're talking about the old Met. So I
I know.
grew up in the old Met
Wow.
before I actually went to the new Met to see things like Anthony and Cleopatra and so forth.
But
And I
Catherine, I'm going to stop you there just because there are three more New York things I want to get to, and then after that, it's entirely about you and your work. Number one, a venue that seldom gets mentioned but should be back then and now. There are two more actually. One is called City Center, and
uh-huh.
the other is called Town Hall.
Yep.
And these are known to New Yorkers, but not necessarily to other people. City Center was founded by the Mayor LaGuardia,
Yep.
and the New York City Opera and the New York City Ballet companies,
Right.
the people's companies, were founded in that building with the support of the mayor in the 1940s during World War II to make these art forms accessible to every New Yorker. Then there was Town Hall, which is a very old and wonderful space. I don't know the acoustic in there very well. I've never stood on it. I was on the stage once, but I didn't perform as a soloist. And but it's a wonderful gathering place. It has done programming of speakers, thinkers, musicians, often, for example, Joan Sutherland and Marilyn Horne famously performed there together for the first time at Town Hall, not at the Metropolitan Opera. And it's tucked away on 43rd Street and not known to a lot of people, but these are wonderful venues that also open their doors to New York City children. On 46th Street at that time was the High School of the Performing Arts before joining LaGuardia. Um, then there's the fact that we grew up in a time when the New York City Theater District had magnificent musicals, of course, but also the greatest actors. We still do, but a lot of them come, they make it sort of a special thing to come to Broadway and show up for a few weeks and sell out the theaters. But at that time, we had actors who would have a season every year on the New York stage. I particularly was taken with certain women, Colleen Dewhurst, Jessica Tandy, Maureen Stapleton, who every year would come in with a new play. Jason Robards among the men, Christopher Plummer, and you got to see these great, great actors, and we'd have visiting actors from Britain and elsewhere. And I would go to shows for $2, for $3, sitting all the way upstairs. And so I can claim to have seen just about every musical and play that appeared on Broadway in the 60s and into the early 70s until I moved to Europe. And that is something that at that time was very, very accessible. Did you go to a lot of theater as a girl?
A little bit, not as much as you did, not at all. But some of the things that I do remember that were exciting. First, by the way, I just wanted to interject about Town Hall. I also performed there, which was very exciting because I was able to do the Schubert Shepherd on the Rock, Der Hier
Uh,
auf den Felsen, so in Town Hall, which I found. It's funny when you mentioned the acoustic situation, whether it was good or not. I think it was fairly good. I remember feeling a good feedback, and I don't remember it being a problem. But as far as musicals and such, not a whole lot. There were certain things that were more dance related that we did through my family because my mother was a dancer. And so we attended a lot of dance programs. And one that I remember with great excitement in my memory was something, it was an evening of Jerome Robbins.
Mhm.
What was that evening called? It was really, I think it was called Dances at a Gathering. I'm not sure, or but it was an exciting night of Jerome Robbins choreography, and there were so many ballet things that we went to see, especially American Ballet Theater, but New York City Opera, sorry, New York City Ballet,
Mhm.
and particularly American Ballet Theater, and seeing works of Anthony Tudor and so on and so forth, who my mother knew because she worked with him, danced with him early on. But as far as musicals, no, sadly not. Um, I don't think our focus as a family was so much in that direction. To be honest, I mean, we watched some of it on television when that came around, and films, but I don't think that was a huge part of our upbringing
Well, I'm
as
going to interject something that to you and to me is obvious, but I realize it's not to all listeners. Broadway musicals at that time, and there were many great stars: Ethel Merman, Mary Martin, Carol Channing, Georgia Brown, endless, Angela Lansbury. I could name many, many, and a lot of men too. They performed without microphones. They
yeah,
had a vocal technique that
yeah.
was comparable to opera singers, with the difference that they performed 8 times a week. And usually at that time from Monday through Saturday night and Wednesday and Saturday afternoon. Now they do Sundays and no Mondays. But because I had a cousin who was in the theater, and she was in a lot of big musicals in the 60s: Gypsy, Hello Dolly, Oliver, George M., Henry Sweet Henry, a lot of them. She grew up, she began in the Met Children's Chorus. Her name was Alice Plotkin. She became Alice Playton. And then, although she was very, very small, she was all voice and acting and temperament. And her first show was Gypsy, and Ethel Merman became the model for sound production for Alice. And then Georgia Brown and then Carol Channing were the first three divas that she worked with on Broadway. And she, to her dying day, never needed amplification. And she loved coming to the opera. Her favorite opera was Wozzeck, by the way. And we would attend all the time because she loved the fact that there were singers who were still not using amplification. And I want to get there in a moment, but I had one other thing I wanted to mention. In New York City, we grew up in performing arts, but there also were in our visual arts. And there's the whole
Yes.
world of museums and art galleries that would inform us about history, culture, body positioning, costuming, color, light, makeup, all of that. And we were often taken to museums, and not just the Metropolitan, but many, to understand the history and the characteristics of roles that we were studying or music that we were playing. Um, and it was all integrated. And I don't know if that was intentional or just that the level of culture among our public teachers was that high.
I think the level of our teachers was very high and steeped in cultural
Yeah.
programs and exposing us to every bit of culture that New York City has to offer, which is mind blowing, but also in classrooms. Because I remember in my junior high school at Joan of Arc, my English teacher, his name was Theodore Levinson, Ted Levinson, and he did something in the class, a couple of things that were just extraordinary. First of all, uh, quite contrary to every other classroom I ever sat in, where everybody sat in rows facing front to the blackboard and the teacher, which I have to say, I'm not in love with that format at all. And in my own teaching, I've adopted Ted's Ted Levinson's model, which was he always put us in a semicircle. So it was, first of all, open so that he could walk into the semicircle and have contact with all of us. And then we could see each other. So that when we were often reading poetry together, or even more exciting, reading plays together, and we
Mhm.
did The Crucible. We read The Crucible, and I was Abigail, which I later also played Abigail on the opera stage,
Yeah.
but I was able to do that role, especially in the parts where Abigail has to scream in the courtroom. And I have a funny story about that, which maybe we'll get around to, but many years later, Ted Levinson came to my performance of Bohème at the Met and wrote me a note. He says, I don't know if you remember me, but you were in my class and you were Abigail in The Crucible, and your screams were blood curdling and so theatric that I knew from that moment that you were destined for the stage, which I think, and we became great friends at that
Yeah.
point. Yeah, so yes, I think it was the level of the teachers, because when I think of the teachers I had, there as well as at the High School of Music and Art, whether it was, I mentioned Sybil Mandel, she placed me right away from when I first came in into the solo voice class. I was the only person at the beginning stage being put into that class, and and she was responsible for assigning the Poulenc Gloria for me to sing as soloist. And I think of all the people that attended that school too, people like James Conlon, was at that school. And
Conductor. Yeah.
I mean, huge list of artists who became famous later on. Elmar Oliveira, I think, was at that
Mhm.
school, if I'm not mistaken. So many interesting artists. Janice Ian, Laura Nero, as I had mentioned, and the programs that we did, whether it was a Bach Magnificat, I did there as a soloist as well, and there were other teachers there at the school also who were brilliant professionals.
Mhm.
So yes, I think we were lucky in the time that we lived in New York City. It was a great time, and some of these, I mean, when I think about New York City Opera too, which happened rather early in my career, and then the Met, but point being that we had a lot of people who came from Vienna, you know, uh,
Yes.
and a lot of these great people who had to leave in the Second World War. They had to leave and they came to the States before the war, luckily, but they really had a big mark on our city life. They brought so much of the culture of Europe into New York.
Let's be very specific about that. East 86th Street were Germans, West 72nd Street were Austrians. And it's true. And I knew by the restaurants that were on the Upper East Side in 86, and in that area too were Hungarians
Oh,
and
on the
Czechs
east
and
side,
so
I
on.
know the
But
German
on
town
the West
areas.
70, the Viennese wanted nothing to do with all those people. So they clustered on West 72nd Street. And
Yeah,
West 72nd Street, at that time when we were kids, had bakeries and cafes like Vienna,
yes.
and they all rivaled one another. For there was the Eclair was the most famous, and Cake Masters and the Royale. And I basically would do what I called the Via Dulcis, going from one bakery to the next to do comparative tasting of these different things. And I would meet people who were refugees from Vienna, and they would talk about the singers and the instrumentalists they heard, and they would say, yeah, my teacher studied with Brahms. And I would sit there because they recognized I knew who Brahms was, and I would be drinking my milk and having my cake, and they would tell me about all that. And what is stunning in New York more than most places, although you find it in London and other places, but not like here, is the DNA, the cultural and the historic DNA that we have in our city that gets blended in that the fact that and I'm sure you met these people who came from Vienna, who had heard Mahler conduct all that. It goes straight back. And part of our jobs, you as an artist, I as a communicator teacher, and you're a teacher as well, um, is to bring this along and pass it along, as I know you do and I try to do as well. But I don't think every child realized back then the immersion that we were having. I'm sure you did.
I was aware of it, but and but it was so like a part of my, not only my DNA but my daily life, because every day was filled first of all with the sound of my father's violin in the other room, because he practiced every moment when he wasn't at the Met, rehearsing and performing. Every other moment was given to his practice for solo repertoire, his recitals that he was preparing for. But, and just because he was a devoted violinist who felt that you can't get better unless you practice every day, which is what I learned, and it was great. I learned many lessons of discipline from my father. Also, he became my teacher, my
Mm-hmm.
personal teacher at a certain point. But every day was filled with delightful conversation. My mother was an amazing woman because she was a font of so much knowledge about culture. And she herself had a very interesting childhood and life, having been a child actress in Hollywood, but also she was born in Shanghai and lived there for 9 years of her life first, and then she was an only child, so she was like a little princess, and so she, yeah, this is my cat, Lula, just passed by, and so with her, every day was filled with conversation about, well, if it wasn't painting, it was about music. And if it wasn't about music, it was about dance. And also, she put on music all the time of all sorts for us to dance. So we were always dancing. And I will just take a moment. She will hate this, but she's so beautiful.
What's your cat's name?
Lula, Lula. And she's a Turkish Angora, and she
Beautiful,
is now 15 years old.
beautiful.
And she's a beauty with two colored eyes, yellow and
Yeah.
blue.
Mm-hmm.
And she will tolerate being held like this for another 5 seconds, and then she'll want to go, I'm sure. But anyway, so our household was filled with so much music, dance, playfulness,
Yes.
cats, pretending. My sister and my brother also. We all played. We did made up plays and all kinds of things. So, and we drew, and everything was about the arts in our household. So it was a treasure trove of a youth to grow up with all of this inspiration in the family and also in New York, because, like you, I went to all the museums of New York, all of them, and art became a passion for me as well. But I think I was just so lucky to do all of this at home. The fact that my mother was the one who introduced me to Janis Joplin
Mm-hmm.
was amazing. And we would sit and listen to her and talk about how her riffs were like cadenzas,
Yeah.
and I was inspired by the ability to create such individual expressivity in the way she sang, and especially when she went into her extended riffs that were like cadenzas in bel canto, and it was thrilling, and we listened. One of the pieces I would have liked to have on the list is this Gunther Schuller piece that I mentioned, the Symphony for Brass and Percussion, because also Gunther Schuller wrote a piece for my parents to perform at Carnegie Hall called
Oh,
Symbiosis. with violin, piano, or percussion, and dancer. So I saw my mother also perform, thankfully, and I saw my father perform at Carnegie many times. But Gunther Schuller was an extraordinary composer. That particular piece, my mother put it on for us to dance to, and there was one particular movement in which it had something that was very influenced by Berg and Stravinsky, and I found a way to dance, and I had long hair already, and to
Mm.
move my head like this with my hair swirling around. And my mother always thought that that was an amazing gesture that I created for myself listening to that music. And I think of these things, and it's pre Salome, it's pre any of this, the things that I was eventually going to do. And I realized that all the training I had at home with my parents, my mother being my editor and my eye so often, attending performances and giving me feedback, was so important. My father becoming my teacher and teaching me so much about style and um, different ways to look at music. And his most, maybe the most poignant gift he imparted to me was really that technique is a very important aspect, but it's nothing if if you're not expressive. It has no real meaning unless it is directed towards communication and expressivity. So from an early age and his training, I realized that all the technique that he taught me was all for the purpose of being a highly expressive artist.
Well,
And
I'm gonna make a comment and then lead to a question. So you don't have to respond to the comment. But part of what has always drawn me to you in terms of your work, yes, expressivity, but I always felt that your characters, not you, but you were the vehicle for the characters, your characters had something to say. I didn't feel that you, the singer, the artist, was taking on the notes and the words and so on, but that somehow you were infusing each one of them with what their essence was as you understood it. And in many, many, many cases, I could name one, but I could name 100. I'll name one, Antonia in the Tales of Hoffmann, but I could name many. They became, for me, the definitive expression of who that character is. And while I've seen many other women play Antonia, play Lulu, you name the role, um, there are certain roles that I came to understand so much more about the character through your performance and your belief, if we can use that word, that they had something to say. So that's my comment. My
thank you.
question is, um, at what point early in your education did you start setting your sights on the stage for yourself as your career?
Strangely enough, it came rather late. Most people would say, "My goodness, really? Wouldn't you have from the get-go with the family you grew up in and all the training you had and the opportunities?" And people always, you know, from John Motley to Sybil Mandel to Ted Levinson, all these people in my past who, when they say it takes a village, it's really true because I have to say that I owe everything to myriads number of people, also Matthew Epstein, who later on became my agent, but there's so many other people. George Schick, who was the head of the Manhattan School of Music at one point,
Mhm.
and and had me sing. We are not even talking about Manhattan School of Music, how important that was, because that's where I started to do opera. And I do think it probably started to emerge around that time. My early ambition centered mostly around dance and around acting. I happened to sing, and that was the thing people pointed out all the time. It was my singing. And I was given opportunities to sing solo from a very early age. So I was always cited as a singer from I mean, as a talent from people around me in terms of my singing. But my secret wish was to be a dancer. My secret wish was to be an actress. And it, you know, obviously these three things, singing, acting, and dancing, became obviously the triumvirate of my experience of being in opera. And once I start, I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out
Mm.
in a way, because I think I was just living it all so organically day to day that I didn't see it. I didn't set it aside as that's the career I want to do. I was just doing it, and I was always in the theater seeing performances at the Met. But I think there were a couple of really, I would say, uh, epiphanies happen in a couple of performances, and I'm going to cite one of them, both of them actually, because they changed my viewpoint on the possibilities of becoming an operatic singer, which I knew that that was a possibility. It was a performance of Butterfly at the Met, and it was in the old Met, and it was. I saw Butterfly subsequently with a lot of people, and maybe even before with a lot of people, even Stieber and Tebaldi and so forth. But it was this one particular performance, and I cannot even tell you why, but it was um, um, Tucci.
Gabriella Tucci.
Gabriella Tucci, who, in terms of fame, she was very well known. She was a very fine singer, but did not have the fame of a Tebaldi or a Callas. She, perhaps you would say that she came along at maybe the inopportune time for her in her career.
Mhm.
But she came to the Met in 1960, and she did Butterfly at that time for the first time. And then there was a one performance in 62, and then in 64 she did a myriad number of Butterfly performances, which is I think when I heard her,
Mhm.
because I would have been around 16, and that would make sense. 60 would have been too early for me to have had the reaction I had. And it was with people like George Shirley was the tenor,
Yeah.
and I think it was actually it was George Schick who was the conductor,
Hmm.
which is also interesting in terms of my later connection to him. But I don't know why Butterfly suddenly hit me with an avalanche of feelings. And I sat there. Well, it's easy to understand, but I had heard Butterfly before and I had seen it before. But this was the first time that sitting in the, maybe it was the age I was at.
Yeah.
After all, 16 is the also the age of many of the characters I played, you know. So something started to happen at that age. And I remember at the end of the show, I was sobbing so heavily, uh, it was racking my body, and I mean, a puddle of tears, so much so that I could not get up and leave. And I was not low; I was higher up. I'm not quite sure where I was sitting, but not so high that I couldn't see her well. But the third act hit me like a ton of bricks, and I thought, "Oh my God, this is what I want to do."
Mm.
So I think it started to dawn around that age, at 16. And her performance, I think, was, I don't know, for some reason, it just hit me so strongly. I even had, I mean, the usher finally had to come to me and say, I'm so, so sorry.
Closing.
Yeah, I know that you seem very moved and so forth, but you need to leave now. And it was very hard for me to regain my sense of gravity and my sense of I actually lived in the world. You know, I felt so swept away. The other person that also hit me in that way was Carla Fracci.
The ballerina.
The ballerina Carla Fracci, Italian ballerina, and I had seen her at American Ballet Theater in a production of Giselle with Eric Brun as her
Hmm.
partner. And the thing that was so extraordinary about Carla Fracci wasn't she was a very fine dancer, a very beautiful dancer. But I didn't think it was the dancing so much as what she was able to do with a gesture, a turn of the head, just a hand near her face with such an intensity that I got into the soul of Giselle through her. It was not Carla Fracci performing; it was the role of Giselle, that she was brought an incarnation that was so special. And again, in the last scene, when she dies and becomes a part of the Willies, the
Hmm.
women who die out of betrayal, betrayed love, and so on. I guess we have a few operas like that.
Yeah.
Uh, and she was sheer magic. Again, I was crying buckets, but I saw in that moment, this is what I want to bring to opera.
A
What
little
she,
known fact, sorry to interrupt, is that Puccini was inspired by Giselle, and one of his early operas is called Le Villi,
yes, of course,
Villi, which
that's
is the Willies. It's
that's
that
right, the Willie.
story,
I
but
know, and what a
people don't.
connection!
Yeah.
What a connection!
Sorry to interrupt. You were talking about Fracci.
No, no, no. And Fracci, what was so wonderful, I mean, Fracci then became a kind of a little bit of an, I didn't really have so-called idols and so forth. I never really did. But she was an inspiration, there was no doubt. She was an inspiration from an acting point of view because I understood ballet and dance very well, having been brought up in it. But I didn't see very many dancers that brought that dimension to her dancing. She became a character to the depths of her core.
Hmm.
And I thought, okay, ballet and opera have similarities in terms of historic operas and historic ballets, and even contemporary ballet, because I loved Anthony Tudor and all his Pillar of Fire and Lilac Garden art for me amazing. And through my mother, I knew the dancers who danced in those pieces, and it was thrilling to see his works because
Hmm.
they were contemporary and also psychological.
Yeah.
So his ballets also influenced me greatly, and not to mention films and actresses that affected me strongly throughout my life. But it was finding the sort of connection for myself to the opera world, which I had been totally exposed to from childhood, to see that there is a bigger dimension, because I won't name names of very famous singers that I saw. I saw some of the greats. I saw the greats at the Met, but sometimes acting values were not convincing,
No. No.
and sometimes it was almost laughable to a young child like me, to see two fabulous singers. If I told you the names, I'd be, probably condemned. But I am not going to mention names. And somehow, when they came together to embrace, uh, it was not convincing. They just could not really come into their characters, even though I did see also performers at that time that were able to be their characters very well. People like Tibaldi, who I saw a lot.
Yeah.
She was not necessarily histrionically someone that you would say was detailed, but what she was with her voice was extremely detailed in
She
her
was indeed.
expressivity. So I learned a lot from listening to these great singers bring it into their voice. So it wasn't only just the histrionic that moved me. It was also, as in Tucci with her butterfly, she did something in the singing of it. Of course, it was Puccini that also just overwhelmed me, as well
Hmm.
as Tosca when I first saw it. So Puccini became a love, and Puccini is the composer I have sung most in my career, in
Do you
fact.
recall who was your first Tosca?
Probably Tibaldi, but it could have been. I even think I might have seen Birgit Nilsson. I might have seen, who else would I have seen? Uh,
Leontine Price
I
or
think I saw
Leonie Resnick,
Leontine,
Regine
Leonie
Crispin.
Resnick, Crespin. Yes, I saw all of those ladies,
Yeah,
and and I might have seen Staber if she
yeah,
was.
sure.
No, the other one, the other glam lady. No, from earlier on, I can't remember her name. Anyway,
Dorothy Kirsten.
yes, there you are,
Yeah.
Kirsten. So I saw all of those ladies. I saw
Mhm.
all of them, and um, I don't know that I would single out any one of them as. I mean, I saw Callas only in the great Covent Garden film, the
Yeah.
second act, and unfortunately, I could have seen Callas, and I cannot for the life of me tell you why that did not happen. I think it was just for some. Well, first of all, she didn't sing that many performances at the
She
Met.
sang it twice, March 5th and I believe March 8th of 1965, because I was taken to one of them. The tenor was different. I had Corelli, the other performance had Richard Tucker. Tito Gobi was the baritone in both, and Callas was the soprano, and those were the last two. My father definitely was not a Callas guy. He was a Tibaldi person.
Yeah, yeah,
But
I know
he
there
took
was
me because he felt that I should have the
be
experience of
educated. Yeah, in
attending
that.
Maria Callas. I
Yeah.
had never seen Tosca. I was 9 years, I was not even nine, I was almost nine. And I was fascinated by the whole thing. But when I came away from it, the person I was completely swept away by was Tito Gobi.
Well, of course.
Corelli had a beautiful sound, but I didn't know enough about sound. And Callas was everything she was, and it's the only time I saw her perform live. But it was Tito Gobi. And I
Yeah.
must say that because of that experience, that's what pushed me along a road into opera. And years later, he became my teacher in Italy,
Wow.
not for
That's
singing, but for
incredible.
production, direction, drama, all of that.
Incredible.
And so I mention that because these individual performances, like you with Tucci, me with Gobi on the Callas Tosca night, they change us. And
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And there were a lot of other things that happened. I mean, it was amazing to have seen something like what was that opera, Offenbach opera, not Pericole, but the other one, Gypsy Baron,
yeah,
Strauss, Johann.
mhm,
Uh, am I correct in saying
yeah,
Johann Strauss? Yeah.
Zigeuner Baron, yeah.
Yeah. And do you remember? I don't know if you were in that year able to have seen this. Cyril Richard,
The
who was
director, yeah.
Captain Hook.
Yeah.
No, he was a performer in
Oh,
that
that's right.
performance with
Yeah.
Patrice Mansell. And
I
that was
didn't
a
see
very
it.
exciting performance to see early on. And it might have been um, well, I don't remember the rest actually, but I remember the two of them. There were so many things. You know what was also incredibly inspiring to me, although it went into the hopper, as it were, for years later. It was when I was a child, and I don't know. Do you remember this? The $1 Million Movies on
Sure.
WOR
Channel
Channel
9 or Channel
9.
9,
That's
yeah.
right, Channel 9. Only a few of us who've been around at that time will remember it. But they had this incredible tradition of showing something for an entire week and multiple times a day. You know, on certain days they would just keep showing it. Well, at that time, and I'm talking about when I was about 7 years old, 7 to 9, they showed an opera film that was called La Forza del Destino.
Mhm.
And I fell in love with that music. I didn't know from Verdi yet, really, 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 but I thought the music, especially the overture, was stunning, and the fact that it kept coming back, as a theme. And my sister, my brother, and I sat in front of that TV every night
Mm.
for a week to watch La Forza del Destino. And I do, signify that as something. that went into my brain as, because this is the reason why. Uh, it was the locations, it was the acting of the, most of them were film actors. There was one exception. Um, I think it was, I can't remember who it was, but in any case, there was an exception, as it was a singer and an actor. And I thought, oh my God, this is so exciting. This music is amazing. And look at these actors in these locations with big, gigantic rock walls and things like that. And I was thrilled by it. So I think of that as being a little grain that went into my brain for my eventual things like Tosca, live
which
in.
I want to talk to you about.
But
We'll get to that.
anyway,
We'll get to
it
that.
was
Yeah.
an inspiration
Yeah.
very early on in my life. Actually, it was Leonard Warren that also was inspiring, because La Forza del Destino was another situation. Leonard Warren, of course, as we all know in opera, died on the stage
During La Forza.
during La Forza. And my father, of course, was playing that night. And
Mm.
what was unusual about that night was the fact that my father came home very early, after the second act or in the middle of the second act, because he died in the second act.
Yeah.
And the snakes that we had at home, the opera snakes that we call them,
Hmm.
listing all the operas for the week, were
Sheet of
always
paper. They
posted
don't exist anymore, but these were sheets of paper, long like snakes, that indicated all of the Met performances scheduled for a week.
for a
And I
week.
still have the last one from the old house. I framed it.
Yeah, I have one here too, and it's from the first week of the new house.
Okay.
And it's quite something to look at the casts. But of course, every night when my father took off to the Met after our early-ish dinner so he could get to the Met, we'd always look on the snake and see what time he's supposed to arrive back at home. So that night it was extraordinary when he came home very early, and we thought, what happened? And when he told us about that, that also really struck me.
Yeah.
I was in my early teens,
Hmm.
and I thought, incredible! It must be incredible to die on the opera stage. I
Yeah.
thought it as actually something extremely not frightening, but almost, I don't know, romantic in a
Yeah.
strange way. Yeah,
Dying at the scene of battle.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, which made it also so dramatic in my mind, as I died a lot of times on the stage.
Yeah.
That was also one of the things that was a seed in my brain. And the other thing that will be a part of some of the things we talk about in terms of the Met, that was much later, was the fact that, my father was playing in the Met Orchestra at the time that I started singing at the Met in 1979. He was still there, and he was there for many of years of my Met singing. Uh, and so it was in Traviata, and the reason I have that Traviata prelude to the last act of Traviata.
On your
My
list of
area.
recommendations. I'll tell the listeners about those in a
Yes, you
moment, but
should. But I
Forza,
want to tell you
Traviata,
that
Butterfly.
story is because it is my in that particular production was a new production, and Ileana Kotrubas had premiered it. But then I took it over after she did some but very few performances, and I did a lot of performances in the, I think, 81, 82 season. Uh, Interesting little side note. Since previously Mafo, she held no, actually Albanese probably held the record for the most violettas. Then Mafo in a certain period. And then since I sang those Traviatas in 81, 82, there I have the highest number of performances as Violetta at the
Hmm.
Met, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But in that production, it was a new production. I was sitting in the bed of the last act, getting ready for the curtain to come up. Well, the curtains had opened, and there was what you call a scrim, that when you put light on it, you can see through to the Violetta in the bed. But prior to the light coming and revealing me, I was sitting in the bed and I was looking down into the orchestra, and I could see my dad
Hmm.
during that prelude. And I can't tell you how much I held that moment all through all the performances I was doing.
Yeah,
Every night I sat there and looked and just absorbed the sight of my dad sitting there and thinking to myself, how lucky am I? This is amazing. Remember this. Your dearest dad, who was your mentor, your teacher, is right there in the beginning of this last act. And it was, for me, so special to be able to be at the Metropolitan in my heyday, as it were, with so many performances that my dad was involved in. And he was always at the end of every performance I ever sang when he was playing in the pit. Sometimes he had a night off, and sometimes he asked for a night off so he could sit out front and watch me. But every night he would be there for the curtain calls and watch me, and just be there as a supporter for my curtain calls,
I
which is
remember that.
something I just cannot forget, this kind of connection of our family and the Met.
Couple of things, a lot of things, but one is you were talking about that scene in Traviata in the prelude and last act. One of your illustrious colleagues who succeeded you in that role, by the time that she reached that scene, she was exhausted and hungry. And she used to take ginger biscuits into the bed with her, and all during the prelude, she would eat ginger biscuits, which I cannot fathom the dough and the flour and the sugar and the ginger, but maybe the ginger, but everything else, no. And after the performance, the stage crew had to come in and vacuum the bed, which was just covered with crumbs. And
I
one time
imagine. Yeah,
there
that's
was a
crazy.
package from the ginger cookies biscuits that she had imported from her country. And it was quite something because I wanted to say to her, how can you even sing? And I would listen when she would say the first line, Anina, and one time her mouth sort of stuck together from the biscuits, but she did it. She was great. But I cannot imagine at that moment eating in that bed during
Maybe it added a certain, some kind of a je ne sais quoi to the
a certain ginger to
characterization.
the whole
Yeah,
situation. But you just
certain.
reminded me of that.
Yeah.
Also, just remind listeners who don't know, the period that Catherine is talking about, beginning in 1979, is when I went to work there
I,
at the Met as well. But you and I didn't really get to know one another at all. You know this, Catherine, and the reason is part of my job was to be of assistance to artists who needed help, who needed the manager, who needed someone. And I never met you because you were so secure in that place, as it was your home and your father and the orchestra all supported you and so on, that not once in that whole period did we ever meet or connect because you didn't have a need for my services, which I'm glad we met later. We met in Chicago, actually, when I'll get to Chicago a bit later. But so there's that. I want to mention that on your list of recordings, I'm going to mention the list now just so that we have it.
okay. Yeah.
The Brahms Violin and Piano Sonata number 3 in D minor, opus 108, David Oistrakh on the violin. Verdi's Overture to La Forza del Destino, Riccardo Muti conducting La Scala. Son Pochi Fiori, sung by Marilla Frani from Mascagni's Amico Fritz. Verdi's Rigoletto, the Maria Callas Tito Gobi scene, which I love. Tutte le feste al Tempio, with Tullio Serafin conducting. And there's a wonderful old YouTube of Gobi with Lina Pagliugi in that scene that's just astonishing.
That's right.
Puccini's Madama Butterfly, the suicide scene at the end. We have Tibaldi. And we have James Levine conducting Act 3, the prelude that we just spoke of, La Traviata. I don't do this with many artists, but I added this myself. The performance of Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito, conducted by James Levine, that was done in the late 70s that had Carol Neblet as Vitellia in Salzburg, Tatiana Troianos as Sesto, you as Servilia, Titus was Werner Helwig, and then Eric Tappy at certain performances, and Kurt Riddle. And the production was by Jean-Pierre Pinel. And I added that because that was one of the performances, like the kind that we were mentioning, that completely turned my head around. I had another one in 1979 with Andrea Chenier in Barcelona with Caballé and Carreras. And everything about that performance, I didn't know La Clemenza di Tito, so I was blown away by the opera. It's my favorite Mozart and one of my favorites, period. Levine's conducting was exquisite. I had heard him conduct, but somehow that really grabbed me. Um, Tatiana Troianos was astonishing.
Amazing.
And I talk about her a lot, so I don't have to add that now, but she was astonishing. And this was my first exposure to Catherine Malfitano, who I didn't know of, although apparently we overlapped constantly in New York City, but I didn't know of you. And what I said before about that your character had something to say, Servilia is not necessarily the most compelling character in opera. And there she was with the tempestuous Vitellia, with the solid and morally profound Titus, with the conflicted, fantastic Sesto. And yet, I remember coming away from that performance thinking, who is Catherine Malfitano? And so it's from that point forward that I artistically set my eye on you. And so that when you made your Met debut on December 24th, on Christmas Eve of 1979, as Gretel with Troyanos as Hansel, I was there. And one of my favorite operas is Fidelio, and that followed 2 weeks later, and you had Hildegard Behrens and John Vickers. And again, if you have Hildegard Behrens and John Vickers, it's hard to find someone else on the stage, especially as Marcellina, who again, she's the Servilia of Fidelio. And yet, there you were. Your Gretel was great. I don't want to not acknowledge that, but we're talking about Gretel is a great role. These other two are not necessarily the roles that we recall from those operas. And then Ned and Pagliacci very quickly after that. And that's where you really got me. It's not my favorite opera, though I love it, but it's not an opera that I hold close to my heart like Fidelio and La Clemenza. And then very soon thereafter, the Met did a wonderful triple bill of French operas that theatrically were fantastic. By David Hockney was the production, including Parade by Satie, L'Enfant et le Sortilège by Ravel, and Les Mamelles de Thérésias by Poulenc that you were in as Therese, Tiresias, whatever. And it was stunning because that was really the first time that I saw you. Netta was great, but I saw you own the role, the production, be the raison d'etre for it. And the Traviata followed that. But by then I was already very much following everything you did. I'm going to tell you one Parade story, and then I want you, if you would, to talk about some of those early roles. The Met does opera and repertory, meaning that every night there's a different opera on, and usually three or four, even five in a week could be done of different operas in rotation. And the night after you were in Parade and all of these balloons, you can explain the balloons, all of the balloons rose to the ceiling at a certain point. It's up to the stage crew to capture all the balloons and get rid of them. The following night, we were doing Tannhäuser, a magnificent Otto Schenk, Gunther Schneider, Ziemßen production. My beloved Leonie Resnick was Elizabeth. And in the scene where she slowly goes up the hill to retreat and we know to die, and the music is gorgeous, and her acting, even from her back, was better than most people from the front. And in the middle of this, suddenly a red balloon comes down and lands right in front of her. And she took the train of her dress gown because she was great with her costumes. And she just swept it away. And she kept walking up the stage and moving the train, because the train became part of her character at that moment. And it's as if we could see the train and the tail, so to speak, disappear. And then she paused at the very top and then yanked the tail so that that was it. And she gave an extra moment to it. We all forgot about the balloon, even though it was so completely jarring to see medieval Germany suddenly have a balloon drop in. But talk, if you would, about any of those roles, whether Fidelio or Clemenza or whichever one.
Yeah, well, the Clemenza di Tito was an extraordinary experience. All the summers that we did it together in at Salzburg, first of all, because that was my introduction to Salzburg, where I went many times afterwards after Clemenza to do things like Salome and Mahagoni and Don Giovanni, where I played Elvira with Charot. And so it was an amazing time for me to be in Salzburg, but it started with Clemenza di Tito.
Yeah.
And I, of course, I adored my cast. They were extraordinary. And we had such an amazing experience, not only doing it in Salzburg, in the Felsenreitschule, which is an extraordinary theater.
Yes.
It used to be a writing school and other things. And so it's rock and it's carved niches and arches where actors could stand. And I remember very fondly always before I made my entrance for the aria, later in the opera, I'd be underneath because you could. There was a way to travel underneath, and the rocks were always wet down there,
Hmm.
and I would stand down there and just listen to Tatiana sing. Well, actually, it was in the first act, Parto. It wasn't in the last act. It wasn't before my aria. It was before I made my entrance to do the duet. But she was amazing every night. Every night, the audience went wild for her because she
Yeah.
was extraordinary. And I was very lucky to sing with Tatiana at the Met. First of all, in Hansel and Gretel, that was my debut there, and that was amazing. She was a great Hansel, but also she was my Geschitz in Lulu when
That's
I
quite
did.
a transition from two little children in the forest.
Truly amazing. But she was a really great artist, and unfortunately, she left our world too soon. And so Clemenza was great because it also put me together. Well, not for the first time with Jean-Pierre Ponel, because I worked with him in Chicago in Le Nozze di Figaro, but it was the first time that I worked with Jimmy Levine.
Yeah.
And then, and the interesting thing about Jimmy Levine was that, and my transition to the Met was that Jimmy, knowing about me at that point, he became very interested when he heard that I was going to be Anina in the Saint of Bleecker Street at the New York City Opera. In fact, the Saint of Bleecker Street is responsible for both my New York City opera career and my Met career
Mm.
because I sang it in Wolf Trap at first, and Julius Rudel came, saw it, decided he was going to do it at New York City Opera, and then it was televised, 77,
Hmm.
78, yeah, 78, and um, Jimmy saw it and brought me to the Met, and that's how it happened from 78 to 79. That was rather quick in those days to
Yeah,
be able
it
to have
was.
engagements happen that quickly. But the wonderful thing about that first season that I had at the Met was between Hansel and Gretel and then the Fidelio with those two great singers who I had already admired so many times before. And John Vickers was like a great giant hero of mine. I
Sure.
adored him. And Hildegard Behrens was not only very admired by me, but also as a person. She was one of the most stunning
Magnificent.
people I have
Yeah.
ever met in this career. And she had wonderful words, maternal words to share with me and offer to me when I became a mother, especially about breastfeeding. And it was always, she was a great what we say a mensch, and she was,
Yeah.
that and much more. But to be on the stage and sing with her in the first act, Marcelina sings a lot, whether it was the quartet or the trio, and I think. I held my own quite well with her, but I was so inspired by her, and loved being on the stage with her. She was magnificent. And then the Pagliacci was amazing too, because I also got to work with McNeil, and I got to work with um, Bergonzi.
Yes, Carla
Bergonzi.
Bergonzi.
Yeah, and wow, that was stellar. Also, these wonderful. I was a fairly young one compared to those people, but to be able to perform with these greats on the Met stage was part of the beginning of my Met career, was truly inspiring, and there were things that Resnick, you mentioned Resnick. I mean, Resnick later on did Salome in the
Yeah.
production that I did initially in Brussels, and then traveled to Berlin, and she was with me in Berlin, but she also did the other Salome that I did in Salzburg much later on when we did 5 years of it, and she was in Florence. And she loved the Bondi productions so much, and even
Just so I
said
understand, did she sing Salome before you or Herodias with you?
Herodias both times with me.
Okay.
Herodias in Berlin when I did my debut in the role in 1990. And she was Herodias, and oh my God, what a great another one like um, my dear Hildegard. She was an extraordinary colleague, also so generous personally, and I mean, I spoke to her about roles that I was intending to do maybe in the future, which included Leonora, by the way, which I did do later on. Uh, and she was so encouraging, and had such wise words to say to me. But she was so also very how do you say, generous with my portrayal of Salome. She didn't have to be, but she was, and it was just a joy to be with her. But when she came to do that production, that was the Bondi production in Salzburg, but then traveled to many cities, including Chicago and
Mhm.
Paris in the end, with Anya Celia, and Anya was with me in the premiere. Yeah, but then she just adored that production in Florence, and it was like she said, "Oh, why?" To Luke Bondi, who may not have been always appreciated at the Met, but
Yeah.
he was very appreciated abroad, and especially in that production of Salome. But she was like, Luke, why weren't you around when I was doing my, main operas? I would have loved to have had you direct me. So she was so much fun, and her husband too, Elu. They were just
Ernst Ludwig Elu was fantastic. Is.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, but and then the Traviata. I mean, and I got to sing with people like Cheryl Mills and McNeil and Bruzon.
Mhm.
Extraordinary people. So I was very lucky at the beginning of my Met career, and then it went on to more extraordinary things later
Well, I'm going to
on.
go there, but I want to ask you a question that you prompted in my head. Do you know about the Lotte Lehmann ring? I mean, jewelry, not a ring cycle. Do you know about this?
No?
The singer, the wonderful singer Lotte Lehmann, who became a great teacher.
Yes,
And
I know who
I
she is.
never heard her, but she was a great favorite of my father's. Lehmann had a ring that when she retired, she gave to Leonie Resnick as being the heir, the best person to carry on that tradition of what Lehmann was. At a certain point, I guess when she died, it was passed to Hildegard Behrens.
Oh my
When
goodness.
Behrens died, it was passed to Waltraud Meyer, who now possesses the ring. And it will be up to Waltraud Meyer at a certain point to send it along to whichever artist she feels is the best one to bear this tradition. It's a wonderful story, and I'm always amazed that other artists don't know about this because You
Well,
are, you're
I
not Germanic, but you're in that line, so to speak, of the kind of performers that they are and were.
Well, I don't have a story that matches that in terms of a ring or a piece of somebody's costume or jewelry, but I do have a story related to Lubavitch that is
Hmm.
very interesting. Because when I did my first Salome, it was in Berlin at the Deutsche Oper with Sinopoli,
Hmm.
Giuseppe Sinopoli, and that was 1990. And the first night, my very first Salome ever was televised.
Ah.
And it wasn't televised internationally like later on with the Tosca, but it was televised all throughout Germany and other parts of Europe. And unbeknownst to me, a certain very famous Salome from the year around the years I was born, she was watching, and she wrote a letter to me, and I received it on, if not the last, one of the last performances, and it said Kammersängerin Chatterin, because the H in
Yeah.
Catherine somehow gets to be after C. I don't understand that. Catherine Malfitano. And I turned it around and to see who wrote it to me, because it was a very flamboyant handwriting on the front. And
Hmm.
I saw it was Kammersängerin Lubavitch. And I was just like, oh my God, is this possible? And I opened it up, and in basically what she wrote, that she had seen my performance on television, and she thought I was the. This is a really interesting story. It goes on a bit. This you are the best Salome I have ever seen.
Wow.
There's a punchline at the end of this, but anyway, not in the letter. And then she said, "Give yourself to the people; you will receive much in return," which I thought was absolutely an amazing thing to say. Which I totally believed this
Yes.
too already. I felt like that was my calling, to give myself to the people. Because there was a moment where I almost didn't continue my singing career, and I questioned whether it was the thing I should do in my life,
Hmm.
whether it was enough at the service of people. I wanted to do more than what I was doing, but I learned my lesson that this was what I was destined to do.
Yeah.
Any case, I loved what she wrote. And she said, I think I wrote to her and said, I'm beyond flattered, and I am so grateful that you wrote to me. And of course, I know about your Salome and your career, great one, and exciting artist too. And she said to me, if you are ever in Vienna, come and visit me.
Hmm.
So I wrote to her. I was scheduled to go to Vienna. 4 months later, I was going to do Der Ferne Klang, and um, by Schrecker, Franz Schrecker.
Hmm.
And I almost didn't do it, but I was convinced to do it. And I wrote to her and I said, it's strange, but I am coming to Vienna and I will be performing. So I would love to visit you if that is possible. And she said, well, you call me when you get to Vienna. And I did. I called her. And then she said to me, yes, you can come to see me. And she named a Sunday. And she said, I receive guests between 4 and 7 or something like this. And then she said, it will be fantastic to meet you. She gave me her dress and everything. On that Sunday, I happened to be doing an interview for how do you say, a guild for the Vienna Opera that was a whole, they always were interviewing artists, and so I went to do that in the afternoon, or early afternoon. They presented me with a huge bouquet of flowers that were just gorgeous, and then I went on to her place. And oh, and by the way, every chapter of our writing or speaking to each other, she always said, "You are the best Salome I have ever seen." That was what she said every single time. Here it comes, Fred. So when we arrived at her home, and I had said to Stephen, "Oh, should we bring our camera along? I feel like this is such an important occasion." And we decided, no, that was kind of gauche. Maybe that's not a good idea, and so on and so forth. Anyway, she opens the door when we arrive, and she's wearing a very interesting combination of colors, very huge personality at the door, huge. And she said, "Oh, Catherine, come on in." And as we're walking in, and I gave her my flowers that I had received because I thought, okay, why don't I just pass it on to a bigger diva than me? And she said to me, as we're walking in through the door, the foyer, to go into her living room, she said to me, "My darling, you are the best Salome I have ever seen after me." She left this punchline for months until we were in each other's presence. And then she said that. But she said it with such charm. I laughed, and
Yeah,
we laughed together, and it was delightful. And we had a wonderful couple of hours together. I have some amazing pictures from it. And there was a photographer she brought to the
ah,
occasion. She said, "This is very important. We must take pictures together." And we took a picture in front of her portrait of Salome. And then she had her dog there, Bobolino number three, I think it was.
sure.
And and then she said, "You must ask Opera News. They must put a picture of us in Opera News." In fact, that's what happened. I did eventually have the opportunity to have Opera News put a picture of us in there. Isn't that an amazing story?
It is.
So
And you
I
prompt a
think it's as
question.
worth it as that ring. I really do think that that is something I treasure. And I have her letters and I have these
Yeah.
photos, and I treasure this encounter with her.
You prompt a question. Here in New York, I was talking about 72nd Street before. Another resident of West 72nd Street was the soprano, Croatian soprano Zinka Milanov.
Yeah.
And in some ways, what you describe about Ljubavelic, Zinka had too. And I'm
It's
wondering, did you ever interact with her in terms of her expressing her opinions about, and she would always say that, that's a very good Tosca, not as good as mine, but very good Tosca.
No, I never had any personal contact with her. Of course, I think I saw her in something there at the
Yeah.
old Met. I can't remember what it was, but the thing that was extraordinary about Zinka is that no, sorry, Luba, was that sorry, my earring just fell out, but I'm going to put
Mhm.
it right back on. Uh, she had me sit in a chair right next to her, and she pulled out her score
Ah,
and she went to the last act, those, the sequence after she's kissed the head and all of
yeah,
that. And she just expressed to me, and it was mostly for photographs that she was talking. It wasn't like she really needed to tell me anything, but she was just doing the thing of posing beautifully for the
mhm,
photographs that we were sharing the score together. But my goodness, she started to mention some other singers who had done this or that, and especially Salome or other things. Oh my God, I didn't take any notes. I didn't keep those notes, but she did mention a few singers of great renown that she had some, little spicy things to say,
oh
about
yeah,
how she didn't agree with their interpretation of this or that. So she was spicy. I think she was full of, a very honest and direct commentary. And I treasure it as a memory of greatness. But it was wonderful to meet so many people, via the stage door or the door of the dressing room, people who came backstage, and sometimes great artists from the past. Well,
yeah.
whether it would be Roberta Peters or at that time, who else can I think of? Not it. Yeah, it doesn't really matter, but it's just that wonderful, wonderful artists who are always, people don't understand how very, let's say, persönlich, very personal. Uh,
Personable, yeah.
yeah, personable that our artists are when you meet them
Oh,
directly,
yeah.
and they come across as giant on the stage, but in personal life they're just wonderful normal human beings with wonderful memories and stories, and have a little bit of grandeur about them. But they're really incredibly interesting people. In fact, most of the time, people, when they would meet me backstage, they would always comment on one thing aside from their accolades, but they would always say, "You're really very short." And I said, "Well, yes, I am. I'm petite, yes." And they said, "On the stage, you don't look short." And I always thought that was very nice. I always wanted to be taller than I am, but I also thought I was very lucky because I was always short enough for any tenor.
Any tenor, it's true.
Any
Um,
tenor.
in talking about these women, Valic and
Reason is,
Zinka and the
yeah.
others, one more comes to mind, and I'm going to use her to transition to the next discussion about you. Regina Resnick
Hmm.
was a New York girl, grew up with the same cultural issues that we were talking about. She grew up in the Bronx, and she was very much the artist, the way I described you at the start of this conversation. And by the way, what you said about these artists being full of interesting stories and history, that's why I started this series, Fred Plotkin on Fridays. I wanted to document all of that in ways that are typically not done. So, and you're doing a fabulous job, by the way. Regina Resnick similarly was very much the artist, very professional. She was married to a painter and sculptor. She had a whole ranging career from soprano roles to mezzo roles, and then she became a stage director, and then a filmmaker, and then a teacher. She very smart, very no nonsense. She didn't put up with fools very easily. But on the other hand, if you were open to what she had to offer, she could transmit a huge amount of knowledge and artistry. And I felt very lucky to know her. We worked together a lot. I met her on a show we worked, but then we became friends in 1993. And from that point forward, she and I did a lot together. But um, did you interact with her professionally or learn from her anything?
I would say not directly. I think I met her really personally through you at a
Yeah,
luncheon.
yeah,
And
that's right.
that was the first time I actually interacted with her, I think, in a direct way. I might have met her in other places, but not in a more sort of formal settings of
Hmm.
receptions and things like that. But that was the first time I had a chance to actually interact with her and found her very delightful in our conversation, and easy
Very
to speak,
funny.
and very funny, dry humor, and very easy to speak with, and
Yeah.
fun. So I'm sorry that we didn't get to know each other in other times, but no, not really. But of course, I knew what a great artist she was too. So it's
And there
these
was
are people
something that
that I saw all the time.
she had in common with Carla Fracci, now that we're thinking of those two people. Regina was not a great dancer, it wasn't that. Regina and Carla, who I knew and worked with a lot and saw her in her home in Florence near at her apartment near the Arno, were intensely political. They cared a great deal about politics. Now, I know many artists who follow politics and have their strong opinions, and that's all fine. But for a certain few, Claudio Botto was this way as well. Politics, Leonard Bernstein was this way, are fundamental, and they're part of the artistic mission that he or she would experience and promote. And Regina was certainly this way. Carla Fracci, very much. Um, and I I admire people like that a lot, and in the people I mentioned, I share their political views. But it strikes me that there are many artists who manage to be political without infusing politics into their work. And it must be interesting if you're working with a company of artists from different countries with different political outlooks to sometimes leave that on the side of the stage and bring to the stage what is important for the stage. Have you focused on that concept?
You know, the thing that I have always focused on, especially as an artist, is bringing like all these dimensions of political life, humanity in terms of rights, of human rights issues. These things always interested me, and whenever I could infuse it into any of my roles, and whether I, created a banner for people to know that that's what I was doing. What was important to me that I knew what I was doing in the way I interpreted a character. I mean, playing Leonora was an amazing experience, not only from the political point of view, uh, but also from the point of view of being a woman who would be that incredibly courageous and brave to put her
Mut
life on
und
the line.
Kraft.
Yes, Mut und
Yes.
Kraft. Absolutely, courage and power
Yeah.
and strength. Yeah, because yeah, I'm a strong believer in strong women. I had a wonderful model in my mother who didn't achieve all the things that she should have, but she gave me sort of a passport, as you would, a carte blanche to really become a woman who was independent and become independent of means from any man,
Mhm.
because she believed strongly in that, even though that's not what her life was about. My father was very much the strong breadwinner and so on and so on, but her philosophy of life was very, very, she was a feminist way before feminism. So I learned a lot through her philosophies and her outlook on life, on religions, on different cultures, on different racial and ethnic situations.
Mhm.
She brought me an education that was very inclusive, which again, I feel very fortunate, like I'm sure you are too, that we were born in New York City
Yeah.
and witnessed the things we witnessed. So in recent times, what has been going on, especially in this very special year of 2020, the everything that's going on is very dear to me in the sense that I never imagined that we would have to see so much of it still being a problem,
Yeah.
as we went through it a lot in the 60s and 70s. And we hoped for a better tomorrow in those days, which arrived in some forms, well done, but so many things still such a problem. And this year has brought that into great focus. I can speak about it in terms of what I'm doing right now with my teaching. I direct the Junior Opera Theater, and I'm responsible for choosing our projects, and have enjoyed doing that for many years. And because Manhattan School of Music is doing an initiative for Black composers and the diaspora, and not just composers, but they could be librettists, poets, directors, or whatever. I took this as an opportunity to our production that I'm working on right now, and we're filming it, videos and such, is all based on Langston Hughes. And
Oh.
I'm and it's an amazing thing to have brought Langston Hughes to these young people who did not know this poet. And he wrote a great poem called "Let America Be America Again,"
Mhm.
which is not "Let America Be Great Again," but "Let America Be America Again." It has never been so for me from the Black perspective and so on. But so we are enacting these some wonderful songs by some Black composers, and some composers like Ricky Ian Gordon, but Howard Swanson and Margaret Bonds and H. Leslie Adams, and it's thrilling. A little story that I should share with you. I worked at Padelson's Music House
On 56th
between,
Street. Yeah.
yes, yes. it was between the time that I was still at Manhattan School of Music and I was about to graduate, and I did graduate. So I was working there at the store and selling string music because Mr. Padelson decided, because I had a father who was a violinist, I should, and I wanted to sell vocal music.
Mhm.
In any case, I did always look through the vocal files and see what was there, and I noticed that there was no representation of women composers nor black composers. And I came to Mr. Peterson and I said, I'm noticing that these two groups are not represented in our store. And I said, I would really love to see that happen. And he said to me, would you like to spearhead
Sure.
that project? And he gave me the opportunity to build up a section of women composers as well as Black American and uh, Spanish, brown people, and all kinds of the African American, and so forth, and diaspora, as it were. And that was one of the things that I was able to do in that time in 1972.
Right.
And so it's really something very close to my heart. If that's and that is being political after all. I
Absolutely.
was being political before I was even yet in my career. I was about to go into my career that summer. That was my debut in 1972.
So while you and I know, could speak for another 5 hours, I'm not bringing this to a close yet, but there are a couple of things I want to cover with you that I know are very important in your career, that other people may not know about or may not remember. And one of them is you had a very long, important, profound collaboration with the Lyric Opera of Chicago.
Yes.
And my first mentor was artist Kranick, who was the general director of the Lyric Opera of Chicago before I met you. Um, you and I actually met in Chicago because I had been brought back to do some work there at a time when you were in a production, and that's how we got to know one another. When artist unfortunately was dying by then, she died of cancer, and she took a company that financially was inches from death and remarkably infused it with fundraising and good financial management. She, I'll let you describe her, but she also had the great vision of creating a program called Toward the 21st Century, in which she presented 20 operas in 10 years,
That's
one
right.
by a European, one by an American, that were, a couple of them were older operas and new interesting productions, but most of them were new works or new to Chicago works. And you were, I think it's fair to say, the leading singer in this whole initiative, in that you were in many of these operas undertaking new roles, new repertory, new world premieres. Would you talk about the Chicago period and
Yeah,
artist
Chicago
Kranick?
period is very dear to my heart, and artist Kranick particularly dear to my heart because she is one of the I also, by the way, I call her a mentor because I learned so much from her as well. Things like how she could be strong and very feminine at the same time,
The
very
word she
charming.
always used was dearie.
Dearie, she always said dearie. I call people love a lot and dear as well. But and she, I guess people described her as someone with an iron fist inside a velvet glove. So she was extremely strong in her views about things.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes she didn't agree with certain things, but let them happen because she knew she had to be, let me just use that word, Catholic in her presentations, and she did not want to just enforce her views, her personal views. uh, and we became very, very close friends. Aside from the fact that she was a supporter and admirer of me as an artist, which our friendship had nothing to do with what she hired me to do. But in addition to that, we became very close. Our families became close. We shared one of the Thanksgivings together in a club of her choosing, and being of the Christian Science, flock. She
Mhm.
gave me once one of her the book
Yeah.
from Christian Science with her little something that she wrote in it, which I prize. I prize it, and I prize everything that was a teaching from that world that really enabled her to be a fair leader and a strong leader. She was always at a performance every night, came backstage every night, came to everybody's dressing room until towards the end when she was not as well anymore. She was notable in her opening night parties for being the most amazing speech maker.
Yeah.
I mean, she studied speech making in school as well, acting and singing. So she could deliver the most amazing speeches after performance and give
Catherine, I don't know if you know, she went to a wonderful school that I actually went to as a teenager. I was admitted earlier than typical, and it's a school of speech at Northwestern
yes,
University.
that's it. That's it.
And that also became the drama program where
Yes.
Charlton Heston, many people came out of that. And the School of Journalism was the Medill School of Journalism and the so-called communications concept. But no other place had a school of speech. And it was when I was a 16-year-old there that I met her. And she immediately, in effect, told me that she was going to be my mentor. I didn't have a choice in that. And
That's great.
which was fine. It was fantastic because she guided my early education. I told you about my history teacher in high school. Artist was the next one. I was still in high school, who basically led me down that path to what I needed to work in opera. And she would say to me, I've decided that you should do this, and I've decided that you should do that, knowing already that I had made that decision. But by telling me that she decided, number one, she kept control, but number two, she was reinforcing what she knew was my decision. And it was she who got me my job at La Scala. So,
Well,
yeah,
the woman was truly an amazing woman. I'm surprised there isn't a biography out yet about
yeah,
her. You know, you could do it, maybe, Fred. Because she's an extraordinary woman, and there was no one like her in the business.
yeah.
And she gave me great inspiration that, again, that she was this woman who was able to do as much as she could. But she also gave me opportunities to do some wonderful things at the Lyric. Antony and Cleopatra was one of them. That was,
The
it
Samuel
was
Barber,
Samuel Barber, but with the love duet included, that was not included, and it was not a part of the first premiere.
just for
And
listeners to know, that opera written by Samuel Barber, starring Leontine Price and
I,
Justino Diaz, directed by Franco Zeffirelli, opened the new Metropolitan
the
Opera
new
House in
So can
1966.
you imagine? I saw that production, and my sister was a part of the supers and everything. But I mean, I never dreamed, at that time, that one day I would be doing that opera with this added love duet. And it
Mhm.
was filmed and televised. It has never turned into a CD, which is a shame because it was a really spectacular production.
Yeah.
And then, speaking of towards the 21st century, I did all these operas by William Bolcom there, and it solidified my great relationship with him and later on, I was able to do this great monodrama I mentioned before called Medusa. But there was McTeague and with Ben Hepner, and then
A
there was A
Wedding,
Wedding by Bob Altman, who directed us in the
right?
net with
Robert
Lauren
Altman,
Flanagan, and then
A
the
View from the
final one,
Bridge,
View from the Bridge. And our illustrious playwright was there for
Arthur
the
Miller.
premiere, Arthur Miller. Yeah, an unbelievable production that also came to the Metropolitan and had added arias for myself and Eddie, the character who played
Kim Josephson.
Kim Josephson. Thank you. So we had a wonderful period of greatness with William Bolcom at the helm at the Lyric Opera. And you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, Anthony and Cleopatra was a part of that. And Lulu was a part of that too, because Lulu actually has always had in America a checkered kind of record of not keeping people in their seats because that it's a very difficult opera when prior to the invention of surtitles and so forth. And it was precisely the season at the Lyric when they were presenting also uh, Einstein on the Beach, I believe it was,
Hmm.
if I'm not mistaken, and Lulu, that they introduced. Yeah, oh, Satyagraha it was Satyagraha, and they introduced the titles, and that allowed for the audience to stay to the very end of Lulu.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was mind blowing, and that was an amazing production too. Which I've been able to do some amazing productions of Lulu throughout the world.
Speaking of Lulu, it reminds me that another artist in this line that we've been talking about, the Lehman line and the Malfitano line, who I
Strauss.
adored and actually grew up down the hall from Thomas Stewart and his wife, Evelyn Lear.
Evelyn was with me in the Lulu.
I
In
know
fact,
that. And Evelyn was a Lulu in the, I think it was the Boulez. I'm not certain who conducted her in Paris in a shortened version before they had a
Seven
fuller
Boulez,
version.
I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
And so what was it like working with Evelyn Lear?
Evelyn is delightful. I wanted to
Yeah,
actually, I'm glad you brought her up because she's another one of those fantastic ladies who,
she was.
uh, again, I met her with Matthew Epstein, who was my manager. Initially, I met her upstate somewhere. I can't remember where it was, where she and Tom did a recital together. And I went out to dinner with them and learned about this wonderful couple who they were amazing to behold. They were full of fun and life, and she was incredibly full of life. Always was the one who kept the spotlight on her. Very chattery, full of fun, and very sweet. Always, always, always uh, saying to anyone, who she felt was beautiful, "Oh, you're so beautiful, my darling," or this. But she went like that in her career life too, in admiring people. After all, she had done Lulu when we were doing Lulu together. She had already done Lulu, very famous Lulu, but she again too, like Leonie, was so kind to me and adored my Lulu.
Yeah.
And she meant it, and also was another one that I could talk to and say, "Gee, I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking about that," or she would say, "Are you thinking about this role someday?" She wanted me to do the Marshal, and I didn't ever do it, but there were other things that she said that she thought I should do, or I asked her opinion, and she would say, smart, wise soprano things like, "Well, once you get to be, a certain age, you can do anything you want."
Hmm.
Leonie said the same thing too. They
Yes.
basically said, at a certain point, you just go for whatever you feel like you want to do, and if theaters are going to hire you, go for it, which was wonderful. But she was very touching in Lulu, I must say. I had a great enjoyment working with her in Lulu. She was great. I also had Brigitte Fassbender in the first outing with her in
Wow.
Munich, and what's his name? Who did every well, Hotter was with me as Schigold.
Hans Harter, yeah. Wow.
Astrid Varnay was
Wow.
my garderobier in Munich. I mean, and this woman was fantastic to watch, her discipline and her professionalism. She arrived before I arrived to the theater to prepare for Lulu, and she was ready and dressed and sat in the wings just as Lulu began. So and watched me through the first two scenes before we got into the theater scene where she was focused to be. And she was so attentive and so focused and such a delicious person to know too. I mean, you cannot trade these kinds of moments in life when you are with people who have been themselves great artists, but are and at the core of these people, the generosity is huge, huge.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it runs counter to the stereotype. And something you said triggered a thought that this is very particular to the opera world and perhaps to the British theater repertory system of having roles and then passing them on and mentoring and so on, where I've seen old British actors and actresses who were once great Juliets and Romeos but could no longer plausibly do that decide who should be the next good Romeo or Juliet or Hamlet or whatever. But it's very palpable in the opera world and something I love when I see the good artists say not that that role is mine and she shouldn't sing it and whatever, but saying, I believe you are now ready to sing Elsa in Lohengrin or whatever the role is, and
Absolutely.
give a hand to get them started.
Well, I want to say something quickly, that my mother introduced me to this system of being, let's say, well, in this her case, it was about being a great prima ballerina in the Russian system, because we watched a lot of films from Russia, Plitskaya, Ulanova, and so on. And she spoke a great deal to me about because she also was brought up in the Russian system. She was a ballet dancer that was trained in the Russian system, and because her mother was Russian, Siberian. So she said to me that, when the ballerinas get to a certain age, usually in their 50s, they may still be performing to some degree, but they are already teaching.
Yeah.
They are already coaching, teaching, passing it on. So I understood that concept. And
Mhm.
speaking of Evelyn Lear, we were doing a piece by Thomas Passatieri called The Seagull. And it was in Houston. And it was my very early days of Houston, when I sang there lots in Houston over many years, 25 years, I believe. And uh, I was Masha in the so-called American cast. I was not the main company, but it had people like John Reardon and Evelyn as Arkadina, and Richard Stillwell was in
Yeah.
it, as Constantine and so forth. Flicka was Nina. And that was my first introduction. Yeah, I know, right? It's wonderful, stellar American cast, and also the American cast, which meant that we got one shot at it. But that was a great learning experience, and I got to watch these wonderful people who were just a few years ahead of me. But of course, Evelyn was quite a few decades ahead of me,
Yeah.
and I watched her in those rehearsals, and she was delightful. And she was always rushing out to do tennis when she wasn't
Mhm.
rehearsing and everything. But when I watched her, I really had this was the first time I had this thought: one day I will be the oldest one in a cast with younger people like we are. And I want to be like her
Mhm.
because she was so generous of heart and always had something beautiful to say to every single person in the
Yeah.
cast. Always, always generous and loving. So, for instance, we didn't talk about Tosca, and Tosca was a big
I was
deal in my
about to.
life. In my life,
1992, just so listeners know, in the settings in Rome where Tosca actually takes place, it takes
at the
place
times, yes,
in
at the time,
1800. And the first scene is the Church of Sant'Andrea della Valle. The second
at
is
12
the
o'clock, we
Palazzo
did
Farnese. And
eight
the
o'clock.
last is the
Castel Santa,
Castel Sant'Angelo.
6 a.m. And we did it in that and filmed it in that order. And that was a great event. And it was a miracle of Italian art, because everything
Yeah.
in Italy is always a miracle, because things often seem like they're going to collapse and never happen. And then a miracle happens. And it did happen. And I have amazing stories about it. But what I wanted to really refer to was that was 1992, and it was on July 11th and 12th of 92 that it was seen live throughout the world. And then it was shown later on in a composite, not at the times of, but as a video. And it came to America later in 92. But this past year in Aix-en-Provence, and it started actually back in 2018, I was given the opportunity. Suddenly there was a mail to me about would I play the role of the diva, the prima donna, in a new production of Tosca, to be done at Aix-en-Provence, with Angel Blue doing her first Tosca. And I was given the chance to say no, I wasn't interested, but I said right away, "Oh, that sounds very interesting."
Yeah.
And my first day of talking to the director of that production was 2018 on July 11th, which I thought was very, very, very good luck on the day when I did because that was already 92 to 2018, quite a few years. And cut the story, I did accept to do it. It was an extraordinary experience. It was done last year, 2019, on Aix-en-Provence. And I just did it again in Lyon in January of this year. And it was a thrill to come back to the stage, uh, and be able to do that particular. It was wonderful to work with Angel Blue, by the way, and I had a wonderful Tosca in Lyon, Elena Guseva, I think her name Guseva, and but to be able to be back on the stage and be the incarnation of the old diva, the
Mhm.
diva, the famous Tosca, who is now passing the torch. And it's a very, very moving, I think much more moving in real life than it came across in the film. I saw the film, I wasn't totally happy with it, because it was a very complex production and so many things going on at the same time that you actually had to be in the theater to see what it was all about.
Mhm.
But the marvelous thing about it was a story that the director wanted to tell about the myth of the diva, the prima donna, how strong that myth is and how important it is, mainly about the passing of the torch, and the sadness that does come to the one who loses that career, and not necessarily the happiness after passing the torch, but the necessity of it. And I have to say, of the things that I am really quite proud of and for my own life and feel good about, is that I had, I think, the guts to play this character
Mhm.
and not be afraid to show that transition, and show many women in the audience, especially older women. They would find me on the Aix-en-Provence streets and talk to me, and they would be like, "You brought such humanity to this woman, who is, has no longer in the spotlight, and the reality that you brought to us. It felt so real." They believed this character, and I wanted to bring it. It was not, there were many rehearsals where I cried,
Yeah.
because it wasn't sadness, it was just joy to remember things that were no longer there,
Mhm.
a past that was glorious, and that was not my present. But it was also glorious to know that I could share that and the complexity of being a prima donna uh, in many phases of her life, uh,
Mhm.
which was it was beautiful. It was such a honor.
It's like a Robert Schumann song cycle in a way.
Frauenleben und Leben
Yeah.
and Leben, yeah.
Let me ask what, because you were mentioning that Reasonex said that, if you can do it and if they offer it, would you take it? Have you ever been asked to do the old prioress and dialogues of the
I was.
Carmelites? Did you turn it down? You were not available?
I was not available. I would have loved to have done it. I was also offered the role that I adored Reasonek in, two roles. I did get to do Kostelnichka, and I saw her do it. And
Yeah.
that's when I decided the Met actually offered me Yennefer. I did not accept it. That was dumb, but there were good reasons for it. There were other reasons, nothing to do with the role. But when I saw Reasonek in Kostelnichka, I thought that's the role I want to do,
Yeah.
which I did get to do. But the other role that would be recently was had almost the possibility to do was in Peak Dam.
Yes, of course.
And of course, Rieseneck was brilliant in that.
Yeah.
And yeah, if somebody asked me now, I would do it. Absolutely.
So we're
And
putting the word out there to producers as you're planning your seasons when the pandemic is manageable, that Catherine Malfitano is taking offers for Pic Dame
uh-huh.
and for
What
the
else?
Dialogue des Carmélites.
Oh, absolutely. And there's one other that has, I don't know, that has been written recently is Mother Courage. I want to play that role
Yes, in the opera version.
in an opera version.
Okay. So I'm suddenly forgetting the name of the composer who wrote that. Virgil Thompson, I think. Maybe not.
No,
No, I
no.
guess not.
He did Saints in Four Saints in Three Acts.
Right,
Yeah,
right. Different
but there was
mothers.
somebody, but I don't know. I'm not sure that any we actually ever really got to see it that much. You know, the Mother Courage, but the character really interests me.
But Mother Courage as a stage play has music.
Yes, there's
I
incidental
saw
music.
Meryl Streep do it and Kathleen Turner do it.
Right, right. But it would be great to be able to sing that character. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? It would be absolutely amazing, actually. I'm sure there are other roles that I would love to do as well. But anyway, no, I mean, Fred, what you said earlier, thank you so much for that appraisal of what you felt about me on the stage. I truly believe it is always an honor for us as artists to be a character that is in some parts like us, in many parts not like us, and that we have to actually research in very interesting ways sometimes, and get our inspiration from others and ourselves in many interesting ways from our past, from our life, and everything. But to be able to inhabit the skin of a character for an audience and bring truth to the audience and make it believable. The best compliment I ever received, and it happened a few times with certain roles, obviously, from people was you made this role your own. In the moment, it's not about that someone else won't follow and do it too later on. But in the moment I was doing it, I did want the audience to believe it was my own character. That in a way I invented that character. I
Mhm.
invented the music that I sang. I sang as the character, the way the character had to sing, and say the text that was given to me, because I believe that the character would say these things, and that is the center of being in close affinity and connection to a character, is to believe that it has never happened before. You know, it has happened before, and I learned from all the people before me. But
Mhm.
in the moment that I was performing, I was not thinking about anybody before me or in front of me. I was bringing the character as I felt it and understood it and wanted to present it to the people in that moment with all of my soul and my heart and my intellect and my love, and always felt in every one of those moments a heightened sense of being alive. like every once in a while I feel that when I'm teaching, when I'm working with my students and we're going through some magical music together, I feel just as alive. But the life of being a performer in front of the public is a blessed life, and it's filled with all ups and downs, of course. But in the end, in the fundament of it, I always say to my students, be grateful when somebody wants to hear you or watch you. Be grateful. You have to have gratitude in your heart. The fact that you have audiences, people who want to hear you in an audition, is a blessing that you must not ever take it for granted, and forget about complaining, because that's not, then you're missing the opportunity to enjoy the moment of being able to be someone that people want to watch, and I be carried away by the storytelling and the character. It's thrilling beyond belief. So I try to impart this kind of excitement to my young charges, because that's something I know about and I can impart, and I adore doing that. One last thing, the reason I put Brahms,
Yeah.
and I fell in
On
love
your
with
list. Yeah.
Brahms early on. My father was playing concerts one summer with a young 19-year-old pianist that he was kind of mentoring. And we were living at the house of this young pianist. His parents were away, so we could live there as a family. And on their program, one of the things was that particular Brahms. And I used to sit outside on the porch, just where they were practicing inside the bay windows, and listen to the two of them practice together. And it was at a point too, I was about 13, where I was, becoming much more romantic in my thoughts and body and everything. And this music hit me again like a huge beautiful ton of I don't know, clouds and bricks and everything. And I fell in love with Brahms from that very moment. But I specifically fell in love with all three of the violin piano sonatas, but particularly the movement that I chose for the
Hmm.
list, because it opened up my, the, I would say, the generous side of me that wanted to share all of the angst and the ecstasy that I was feeling from Brahms. I wanted to share that in the world.
Well, Catherine Malfitano, to borrow two adjectives you've just used, you have been very generous, and I am very grateful. Thank
And
you.
I am grateful to you too, Fred, for all you do with all of us, and in every field that you endeavor in. It's so you're generous too in every walk of your life, and it's amazing to know you. I feel blessed to have you as a friend, and know you professionally as someone who is always one who, whatever you do it to the your utmost, and I believe in that as a way of living in life, and so I admire you greatly for
So
that.
do I. Catherine, thank you very much, and I'll
Oh,
see
you're
you
very
soon in
welcome.
one form or another, but I
We
know
will
I
see
will
each
see
other.
you.
Yes, absolutely. And
Thank
thank
you.
you to all the listeners who have come in to watch this program. Thank you.